Hi everyone, and welcome to the sew along video for this top, and I'll show you how to sew both versions of this top. It's a really fast and easy sew, and it's quite an effective design depending on the fabric you choose. So while we're talking about fabric, I've trialed this on a couple of different fabrics. They all work really well: sweater knits, sweatshirting, French terry, even a cotton lycra. So all I'm going to say for this, as long as you have a minimum of 25% stretch, you should end up with a really good result. So I'm going to assume you only have access to an overlocker and a plain stitch on a sewing machine to sew this garment, but certainly if you can get hold of a cover stitch machine, that'll make your hems look really good. So because this is a knit garment, we're going to set our overlocker up with 4 threads of colour that match our fabric. And our seam allowances for this are 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch. So make sure your overlocker is set up to cut at 6mm, 1/4 of an inch. We're not going to cut any fabric off as we sew. We're just going to use that overlocker blade to tidy up the edge of our fabric. So if you have a cover stitcher, that's great. If you don't, I'll show you how to sew the hems on a plain stitch on a sewing machine. So make sure you put a ball needle into that machine, and it's a good idea to lengthen the stitch length slightly. It'll give you a better result. Also make sure you test stitch on spare fabric with your plain sewer before you start to get the tensions right. Now if you do sew with a plain stitch on a sewing machine, just remember that the hem's not going to have as much give or stretch as a cover stitch or a twin needle will on a domestic sewing machine. So just bear that in mind. Right, so when you're ready, let's get started on sewing the pocket onto the front. If you don't have, or you're not wanting to use the pocket piece, just skip this step. So the pocket on this top is more of a decorative effect than a usable one, although certainly you can use it as a pocket. It's set slightly on an angle. So when you cut out your front piece, and this is the front right side up, you'll see 4 drill holes, and I've marked them in here in chalk so you can see them a little bit easier. So this is our pocket position on the front of our top. When we sew it, these drill holes are going to be 1 centimetre in from each corner of our fabric, and 1 centimetre is 3/8 of an inch. But first things first, we need to actually sew the pocket. So take your pocket piece, and this is just a cotton lycra. You'll see when you cut it out, you have notches here. So that shows us the notch on the side here, which is 1 inch down, 2.5 centimetres down, shows us the turn position for the top of the pocket. And then the other notches, which are 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, just show us the side turn positions. So to get started, what we need to do is overlock around the entire outside of our pocket piece. So when you've finished, what we're going to do now is turn the top of the pocket under, and we're going to stitch a line of stitching through the overlocker, and then a second line of stitching parallel to the first. So you'll need to go to your plain sewing machine to do that. So here I am at the plain sewer. I've put a ball needle into my machine, and I've lengthened my stitch length from normal, and I've test stitched on spare fabric. Okay, so you'll see the notch down from the top. That's our turn position. So turn this to the wrong side. And what I'm going to do is sew from the back through the line of overlocking from side to side, and I don't need to back tack. Now I'm going to sew a second line of stitching parallel to the first on the fold side, and that's just to mimic the look of a commercially sewn garment with a cover seamer. And that's where we put our hand for our pocket. Now what I'm going to do is trim off stray threads, just leaving maybe 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to go to my iron and I'm going to fold in at the notch positions, which are also 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to iron this so that my pocket ends up nice and crisp before I try and attach it to the front of my garment. So I've ironed my pocket, and what that's done is give me some nice crisp edges so I can edge stitch that on quite easily. So what I'm going to do is place this pocket on top of my front, and if I've marked my drill holes correctly, those drill holes will sit 1 centimetre in from each corner, so approximately there. So 1 centimetre is 3/8 of an inch. So sometimes it's easy just to put a little pin like that and then put the pin through one of the drill hole positions, and do the same thing on the next corner. So you just have to sort of guesstimate where 1 centimetre in and 1 centimetre down is, and this enables you to start placing that pocket properly. So come to the bottom edge, now it's more important that we cover the drill holes than it is that the pocket gets stretched out of place. So if something's gone a little bit strange or your fabric's moved when you've been cutting it out, near enough is definitely good enough. The main thing is that that pocket sits nice and flat when we're trying to get it into position. So what you need to do now is just hold that pocket in the best place possible, like that. So now we have the pocket positioned properly, we need to sew it on. So the easiest side to start from is this one here. Now I'm going to just simply back tack here, so down and around, and back tack up here. But if you wanted to add a nice little effect, you could do a triangle from here up, across and down. It's entirely up to you and whatever you prefer. So when we sew this pocket on, make sure you take away the pin, and we want to sew it edge stitched in from the edge. So we want to sew it, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch, 2 or 3 millimeters in from the edge, and make sure whatever you do, you sew it the same around the 3 sides, remembering we want to leave the top side free for our hand to go in. So when you're ready, just sew a couple of stitches and then back tack them and continue on sewing. So when you get to the corner, make sure you stop with the needle down in your work, lift, pivot, and then rearrange your work. And when you do this, make sure you tuck any of those stray threads underneath, and make sure that nothing's being stretched out of place. And it's really easy to stretch pockets out on knit garments. So we just want to make sure all those edges are tucked under, and then continue sewing to the next corner. Don't forget to back tack when you reach the end. And now go and give that a press, because that will embed the stitches in the work and make it sit properly. So as you can tell, once you've pressed that, it really sits into the fabric nicely, and you can do all sorts of decorative effects with these pockets. Here's one I did earlier. It's just a leatherette, and I embroidered my logo on it. That's on a really loose sweater knit weave. So there's lots of options you can do with this pocket. If you're sewing view B of this top, you're going to have 2 front pieces. So the first thing you need to decide is, if you're having a pocket sew the pocket onto the lower front piece, following the previous video, exactly the same instructions. And then before you go any further, we need to sew the upper front to the lower front and the upper back to the lower back. Now when they're cut out, they look very, very similar. So how do you tell the difference? Well, there's a couple of ways to tell the difference. If you put the upper pieces together, the upper front piece is lower than the upper back piece. So here's the neckline, so the back's higher, front's lower. The other thing is, if you folded them right sides together, or just folded them together, you'll see a single notch at the center of the upper front, but on the upper back there'll be 2 notches in the center. Double notches mean it's the back. So we sew the upper pieces to the lower pieces and they'll match exactly the same way. In the center of the front piece there'll be a single notch, that's the lower front, and in the center of the lower back there'll be 2 notches. So it's just a matter of making sure that you sew the upper front to the lower front and the upper back to the lower back. So here is my upper front piece. As you can tell, the neckline's quite deep, and I've just popped a pin in the center to help me show where the center of the front is. So then I'm going to find the lower front piece and find that center notch there, and making sure I have right sides together, we want to match that position to this position here. So when you've matched that position, just hold it in place with a pin. And this is the seam we need to sew through. Now as you come along the front towards the wrists, you'll see a single notch there, so those notches need to match there. And then of course the wrist positions need to match. Now you can tell here, because of the stretch of my fabric, that this has got a slightly different stretch, and that's okay as long as it doesn't end up all bobbly after you've sewn it. That should be fine. Ideally, if you can get the same fabric weight for the upper and lower pieces, it would work really well. So when you've got these in position, overlock them together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press that seam. Now because I'm using a shear on the upper part, a lace, I'm going to press this down, which is pretty much what you do anyway with most seams. So this seam needs to press to the lower part, and that will also help with some of this bobbling I've got here. It will just settle it into place. So I'll do that when I press the back piece. So now let's go ahead and work on the back piece. So we're doing exactly the same thing. Let's open it up. And as you can tell, the back neckline is higher, and we have 2 notches in the center of the back neckline there, and on the flatter side there are 2 notches in the center. So I'm going to place that right side up. There's the center of my 2 notches there. And on my back piece, my lower back piece, I have 2 notches here, and they match like that. Now I'm going to overlock them together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and press that now, and press the front piece as well, and from now on the construction is exactly the same as for view A. So now it's time to sew the shoulders. So what we're going to do is place our back to our front right sides together, matching the shoulder seams. And the easiest way to tell the back from the front is that the back is higher than the front piece. So this is the back and this is the front. We're going to match the seam at the shoulder. I'll just pop a little pin in it. And as we overlock down, there'll be a notch to match. Just make sure that those notches are sitting on top of each other. And that'll just help make sure our garment doesn't stretch out of place as we sew it. And then as we come down to the side seam, there'll be a notch here, and that just shows us the turn position for our hem at our wrist. Right, so when you're ready, start overlocking that shoulder seam together. So once you've overlocked this shoulder, go ahead and do exactly the same on the other side. Now let's sew the underarm seam. I'm going to place this right sides together and start at the wrist, and I'm going to sew up through the underarm, and there's a notch to match halfway through, and then we want to make sure at the bottom, when we get to the bottom, that we pivot this so that those seams match, because it will help our seam run at the hemline. Once you've completed that side, make sure you do the same thing on the other side. So now let's sew in the neckband. This is our neckband. Fold it right sides together and overlock this short edge, and this is going to be our centre back neck. Now fold it so that wrong sides are together. And what I'll do, just to mark it a bit easier for the camera, so that's going to be our centre back neck. Directly opposite that you'll find another notch, and that is our centre front neck. Now halfway, or not quite halfway, between these 2 points you'll find another notch, and that notch there will show us our shoulder positions, and that's really important for our stretch. I'm going to pop a pin in at that shoulder and a pin in at that shoulder. Now if you struggle with these bands, just go to your plain sewing machine and run a line of stitching, maybe 3mm, definitely under 6mm, 1/4 of an inch, so maybe 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, just to hold those sides together. When you go to sew it on, that tacking stitch will snap, but it's fine as long as you sew it in the same colour as your main fabric. The threads will just disappear in the seam allowance, you won't need to remove them. So let's place this into our garment. So here is the neckband of our garment. There's a single notch which shows us the front and 2 notches which show us the centre back. So I'm going to place the seam that we sewed of the neckband in the very middle of those 2 notches. Then as I come around, the notch here needs to match to the shoulder seam here, and that shoulder seam needs to face towards the back. And then the next pin that I held in place is the centre front, so that will match to that centre front point. And then we'll go back around to the last shoulder. So now we need to overlock this into place, and it's easier when you're overlocking bands that the band is on top rather than underneath. And it's also easier if you start from a shoulder. It just hides a bit of the bulk, but if you're putting a label in your garment, start from the centre back, because you can hide the overlocking beginning and end underneath your label. So I'm going to start at a shoulder, and the main thing is when you sew this on that you stretch evenly between those points. So just stitch a couple of stitches to hold that in place. And make sure when you overlock that you overlock with all 3 of those edges together, and that you distribute the stretch evenly between those points. And remember to take out your pins. You don't want to be running over pins with your overlocker. What will happen is you will snap those needles. Now I'm not going to, but if you'd like, what you can do is go to your plain sewing machine and making sure all that bulk of the work is down, sew a little line of stitches, edge stitch along the edge of the band. I'm not going to do it, I don't think it needs it, but what you certainly can do is go to your iron and press that like so, and it'll just make that band sit really nicely. So I said this was a really fast sew. We're going to sew the hems now. The sleeve and the body hem allowance is 1.5 centimetres, which is 9/16 of an inch. So if you've got a cover seamer, all you need to do now is go and stitch that at 9/16 of an inch. So I'm assuming you don't have a cover stitcher. So what I'm going to do is overlock all the remaining raw edges so that I can complete my hems. So that means we're going to overlock on the edge of both of the sleeves and on the body of the garment. Right, so go to your iron now and press those seams up by 1.5 centimeters, 9/16 of an inch. Not essential, but you'll find it will help you. So these hem allowances are patterned at 1.5 centimeters, which is 9/16 of an inch, and you'll see the notch which shows us the turn position, and this is 1.5 centimeters because of the curved seam. Anything more, you'll get roping. Now, roping is those wavy lines, some people call it tunneling. If you do get that because of your fabric choice, just reduce the seam down to 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. It should help slightly with that. Right, so the main thing when we sew the hem is start from a side seam and your hems face towards the back of the garment. I'm going to sew this from the back. I just prefer to with my first line of stitching. I always sew my first line of stitching on the back and then my second line of stitching on the front. So all we're going to do now is stitch a line of stitching through the overlocking line all the way around. Remember to back tack. And now, because I want to mimic the look of a cover stitcher, what I'm going to do is sew a second line of stitching parallel to the first, and I'm going to sew that from the right hand side of my garment, starting in the same place I started from. So I'm sewing it on this side, and I'm just going to use the first line of stitching as a guide. So if you have a twin needle, you'll find it very, very easy. Okay, so do some quality control work. And now we'll do the same thing to the sleeves. So with the sleeves, when I sew the seams, I'm going to start it from the underarm point. You can see the notch which helps us show the turn position. And as you can tell, I haven't ironed this. So when I start, I'm just going to tuck the beginning of the overlocking underneath. And then repeat on the other sleeve. So just like that, we've finished. A minimum effort, maximum results. I absolutely love this pattern. It's a really easy wear. You can, depending on the fabric you choose, you can dress it up, tuck the front of it into jeans. It's just really comfortable and easy to wear. Thanks for joining me for the sew along video. I hope you enjoy your garment, and I look forward to you joining me again soon for my next sew along video.